Although they have contributed least to the climate emergency, frontline communities, including communities of color, indigenous people, and the poor, among others, of course, routinely bear its earliest and most severe impacts. Yet these same communities are often the pioneers when it comes to climate solutions. We've heard some discussions about justice and also equity already, but our next panel is actually going to zoom in amid this historic opportunity to build cleaner, more sustainable world and what it means to cover climate justice, such an important issue. Also, how can equity lens help improve our climate storytelling regardless of your location or outlet? So here we go. Please welcome Ezra David Romero, who is a climate reporter at San Francisco's NPR member radio station, KQED, who will also moderate this discussion, and our panelists. We have Manka Behl, a principal correspondent at the Times of India and recipient of another CC Now Journalist of the Year award with an incredible story. Good to see you again. We have Camille, Alexandra, Padilla, Dalmau from Puerto Rico's Nueve Millones. Also, Antonia, Gonzales, managing news editor of New Mexico's Koahnic Broadcast Corporation. And finally, Duncan, Lukoye, multimedia editorial advisor of Kenya-based Disaster Risk Reduction Association of Journalists, or otherwise known as DIRAJ, and a voice of American Correspondent. Enjoy.
Thank you so much. Hey everyone, I'm Ezra David Romero. I'm a reporter at KQED in San Francisco. And I just want to take a moment to celebrate these four people with me. You know, we have a session about climate justice, and climate justice is about caring about the people who are most affected by the climate emergency we're in. And who's better to tell that but people of color ourselves, living and breathing these issues in our families, in people we love. And so I just want to thank you all for telling the stories you do and telling them with empathy. Because I think sometimes what's missing from the climate conversation is the empathy, the lack of empathy that got us into this crisis in the first place. And so I want to thank you all. And I don't know about you, but climate justice is like this buzzword we hear all over the place, right? But what does it mean? Like, when you lean into it, what does climate justice mean? And for me, it's all about caring about people, like leaning into that, taking the time to tell those stories. And I often get asked the question of like, how do you do this? Like, how do you tell a climate justice story? And I just say like, I went to college for journalism, and they told me to like report on people and tell their stories, and that's what we do. I think it's just taking the same knowledge you know how to tell about maybe a white community who's dealing with something and applying it to a black, brown, Asian, indigenous community, island community, and treating them with the same respect and expertise that you would maybe a white climate scientist. And so that's what we're here to talk about today, is how you value communities of color, and that is climate justice. And that's how we do it in our journalism. And I want to give you an example. I cover the San Francisco Bay Area. There's 8 million people there. I started there 2.5 years ago after being a climate journalist for 8 years. And I was like, how do I get to know these communities in this place? There's so many people. And so I found some sources, through friends, through peers. They're like, you should meet this person, you should meet that person. Like what we do as journalists, you rub shoulders and then you go get coffee or a drink. And then I just got to know those people. And over time, a few months, I heard two themes come out of it. One was like, all these climate issues are happening in our community, whether that's pollution rising up in their community, heat, wildfire smoke. And then on the other side, they're like, we want reparations for the past crimes against our lives, our history. And so after listening to these people, they were saying, where I was like, let's tell that story. And so that turned into a series. And that was all based on listening. And that's like the key thing you need to think about when it comes to climate justice reporting is listening, which is basic journalism. It's like what you learned in college or didn't learn in college. And so let's talk about that. And you can do that kind of thing whether you're at the local level or at the international level, And I think if you're at the international level or the national level, you have an extreme amount of privilege to tell a story that can hold people accountable, that can, like, you can also partner with people like us who are in communities telling these stories. In some way, if you're at a national or international level, you have power, privilege, and responsibility, even more than sometimes people like us who are in these communities, and to go further, to tell this story at this like larger level so we don't get a wishy-washy climate story, which is what this conference is all about. And so I want to start with Camille.
Great.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank
We've all heard about the devastating impacts of climate disasters like Hurricane Maria on Puerto Rico. You know, your publication, Millones, takes a different approach on climate change, right? You focus on community and concrete solutions rather than federal politics or political status. Can you give me an example of what that looks like and how did that impact your community?
So, I'm really nervous because I care so much about climate justice. And I care, right? We talk about care. I care so much about where I'm from, and we're constantly, our rights are constantly being violated, right? When you're from a colony, a lot of times we don't talk about the trauma that comes with, because all our life, we're told that you are not worthy. You can't govern yourself. You're not valuable. Those are the narratives that we inherited. So what we choose to do, and so I was here when Hurricane Maria happened. I was in New York. And all of the articles that I saw were very problem-focused, very tragedy-focused. Oh, poor Puerto Ricans. But then when I went back home and I actually communed with people, what I saw, what I witnessed was completely different. It was people organizing, it was solidarity, and that inspired me to return. That inspired me to tell solution stories before I knew about the framework. Because the wisdom that emerged after the hurricane is an ancestral wisdom, is a wisdom that we've always had, right? And the disaster is not the hurricane, it's not the climate event. The disaster is not only the politics, but the economic system that not only creates colonialism, but neocolonialism. And we just want to center people that are self-governing in United States colony, right?
I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
I want you to define what decolonization means.
Yeah.
And how do you put that into your reporting?
Yeah. So decolonization, and I want to say there is no climate justice without decolonization. And decolonization is self-determination. Right now, we don't have the right to decide what happens in our territory. And if the people that love a territory are being displaced from the territory, what happens? The territory will be extracted, right, from its resources, from its health. So decolonizing is giving power to people. And what has happened after Hurricane Maria? There's billions of funds that have been assigned that are sitting in a bank account and have not reached to the communities that are proposing solutions. So what we're doing is just telling the stories of the solutions that are not giving the funds so they can scale to actually bring justice.
Thank you. Let's talk about decolonization with Duncan a little bit more. You know, in your coverage of climate issues, disasters, and solutions in Eastern Africa, how do you address accountability and responsibility in your coverage so people get it, right? Like, you're talking about like large corporations, you know, international influences like India, China, and even the US. How do you go about that?
Hello, everyone. So before I answer,
Sure.
Where I come from, we love greetings. So when I say jambo, please respond back by saying jambo. Is that clear? So Jumbo.
Jumbo.
Better. Jumbo.
Jumbo.
Fantastic. There's something that the MC forgot to say. I think when I'm seated here, I can tell that everyone looks very good. You all look dapper, look sharp. In fact, you should turn to your neighbor and tell him or her, you must have been a very beautiful baby. Yeah, so...
I'm going to ask the question again.
Yeah, so onto your question, I think for me, what is important, especially when it comes to answering that question, is how do you package these climate-related stories in a way that will hold, policymakers accountable. I've realized in my packaging of climate change stories, most of the time, countries that are in the global south are worst hit by disasters, but they contribute the least in terms of global emissions, right? So whenever I go to the field and do these stories, and I get to see how the vulnerable, especially women and children who are disproportionately affected by these adverse effects of climate change, what rings to my mind is, hold on, we have wealthy nations that are contributing a lot of greenhouse gases. You have fossil fuel farms that are contributing a lot in terms of exacerbating the effects of climate change. So what do I need to do to ensure that that community back at home in Kenya is able to have a good progression in terms of life? And I think now for me, the packaging here is holding those multinationals and those wealthy nations to account. One of the ways we normally do that is, and I'll give two examples, for instance. One, just 2 weeks ago, we had the inaugural Africa Climate Summit. I'm pretty sure a majority of you knew about it. And Secretary Kerry came, attended the function. And something interesting happened. He said that, the US is going to pledge $30 million in food security and climate resilient programs. And then he left, right? So it reminded me of a pledge that was made by wealthy nations way back 12 years ago, where they said that they're going to put some 100 billion in climate financing. That pledge has never been redeemed. We are heading to COP28, and we will get to hear so many of these pledges. So they sit at the high table, they make these big promises, and then they disappear. So for me as a journalist, I sit and wonder, okay, so when do we get to see those promises really? Did
you write that story after that?
Yes. Yeah, because what happened is, especially after the Africa Climate Summit, the moment John Kerry made that statement, there were a lot of publications about these follow-ups, because one of the things that I ask myself is, yes, you have made this pledge, but we need to find out where is this money coming from and how will these countries get this money. I think that's one of the lenses that we normally miss out, especially when you're reporting on these things, because you get to hear these pledges and we get all excited, but we lose the nut graph of the story. So how are you going to finance this? Where is this money coming from? The 100 billion, where is it coming from? And how will these countries get this money?
The real stuff.
Yeah, so for me, that's what pushes me to report on some of these stories, so that that lady in Somalia, that poor child in Madagascar, or in Mozambique, in areas where they've been affected by drought, and they have nothing to do about this drought, are able to find justice.
Thank you, Duncan.
Yep.
I want to narrow the focus a little bit. Antonia, many journalists write about people, or they don't write about the people most impacted by climate change, right? Or in my experience, they are like 3/4 of the way down the story, and then maybe the science news is at the top. How are you flipping that narrative? Are you writing your stories in a different way? Tell me more about that.
Thank you, Ezra. Thank you, everyone, and for being here today and letting us and the other panelists. And just want to acknowledge also the indigenous people of this land. And I saw a Native student that goes to school here downstairs, so that was really exciting that we have more Native journalists out there. But yeah, for us, I've been in Native radio for more than 20 years, so I'm so honored that I get to tell our, share indigenous voices every single day. And climate justice isn't just something we report on once in a while. These are stories that are continuing, and we're doing all the time, constantly. And we recently created a climate desk, which features film, radio series, radio spot news, and then each year we have an annual live 1-hour radio broadcast we do from Anchorage, Alaska. And we incorporate all voices, from the people who are on the grassroots level to tribal leaders to federal officials, to world indigenous policymakers, and also I should say that we also bring in the opposing voices, because it's just not one-sided. We have indigenous communities, tribes, individuals who do support mining, who do support pipelines. So, I think when I look at my work, we try to get, like I said, from elders, youth perspective is really important. I think our young people are leading the way when it comes to addressing a lot of these issues. So I think for us, it's a lot different, because we are lucky. I am lucky with the job that I have, that we focus all on indigenous world issues.
So you've talked about how you've covered this range of issues and many people within one community, or many communities in this one community, whether that's Native women in science, Native young people in policymaking. You've also covered some storms in Alaska, and so you've covered the impacts or the effects of climate change as well. You've been doing this for 20-ish years. How have you changed in this process? What is reporting intentionally in this way? How has that changed you? Have you softened? Have you hardened?
I'm human just like everybody else, and these stories are personal, because we reflect, and even though I'm reporting in Alaska, that impacts my Navajo Nation, similar issues, similar stories, and I think one thing that I can say is that, just to the audience here, is to maybe better your reporting is to do collaborations. We do a lot of collaborations. I work with New Mexico PBS, also FNX Television out of San Bernardino, California, Native Report. We've done some stuff with High Country News in the past. There's just ways to broaden it out, but I think definitely not only just having your reporters share those stories, but doing those collaborations, because we're the ones in our communities that best know our communities. Yeah. And so instead of having an outsider go in and try to cover these issues, who better than people who are already doing it on a daily basis?
That's why you should hire people of color. Just hire us. We know, and we have this lived experience. I remember I was in Central California during the drought that happened in 2011, and tons of my Mexican family members and friends were suffering in this drought, right? And it was I was able to tell that story in a different way than others, because we know these people, they're us. Manka, let's zoom out let's go from narrow to wide. You report for the Times of India, where you told me you have billions of readers and listeners. That's a lot. And congratulations. That's awesome. Everyone's dream.
That's because India has such a vast population.
Yeah, India. But still, it's awesome. You've reported everything from environmental destruction and pollution all the way to climate disasters happening right now that are a result of this extractive practice, right? What has covering these stories taught you about these broader injustices of climate change?
Thanks, Ezra. Hi, everyone. I think when I started reporting on climate change some years back, climate justice was just another jargon for me. I was writing about it, but I must admit I was doing it very superficially. I didn't know the real meaning of climate justice. 3 years back, I went for a story on coal pollution, where there were these rural villages in central India. That's where I'm based, and these were the villages where the number of farmer suicides was at all-time high, and they were already struggling with low crop production and drought, and then coal pollution became an added problem for them. And I think that's when an awakening of sorts happened, that these are the voices that no one wants to hear. They are the worst hit by climate change. They're the least contributors to climate change, and nobody's listening to them. And I mean, I just realized that even in an urban city or in a metro city, if there's a pothole and somebody falls in that pothole and breaks a leg, it becomes front page news. And here we had these villages in India where there were acres and acres of fly ash ponds. Fly ash ponds are, they are ponds from which they store fly ash slurry from coal power plants, and it's very toxic. It kills the crops, it pollutes the groundwater, and in these rural villages we had people drowning in those fly ash ponds and losing their lives. We had an 11-year-old boy who drank the contaminated well water and lost his life, and I mean, forget about front news, these were not even being covered. And I think that's when I realized the real meaning of climate injustice. So, and my biggest lesson was, of course, I thought that through my stories I could just do justice to the injustice they were facing. I would also like to add one challenge that I faced, and I'm sure many of you might face. When I initially wanted to write about these stories, I wasn't sure who would want to read about the marginalized communities. They were, of course, not the readers for my urban newspaper, and I was really hesitant. And that's when I thought that, okay, if being a climate reporter, I don't write about those who are the worst hit and the worst affected, what am I doing?
Yeah, are you doing your job?
Yeah, so and then of course, you know, there were ways, though I was writing on the rural population of India, but you know, we as a team at Times of India found ways to relate it with the urban population. You know, it was not just a climate story, it became an agriculture story, it became a human story, it became a health story. So that's how we tried to relate it with our readers.
So you are all from different places around the world, and there's people here that cover your communities from a distance. Maybe they go there, but I'm sure that people get it wrong, like the stories about your communities. I want to ask you first, like when it comes to climate change or even climate justice type stories, what are people getting wrong about India and climate change from what you're saying, and what would you like them to get right?
See, I think over the years, I don't think the foreign media is getting anything wrong. I think they're doing a great job when it comes to ground reporting and highlighting the issues. But I think what's still missing is putting the onus on the agencies that are responsible for this. Like, let's say in India, state-owned coal power plants, they're the biggest polluters, and I think that we are not doing enough when it comes to putting the onus on them. It's been more than 10 years that there have been rules in place for power plants when it comes to installing FGDs or controlling the air pollution, and after 11 years not a single power plant in the country is doing that. So I think that is what remains missing. We need to put the onus on the responsible agencies, which can also build a pressure on policymakers back there.
Does anybody else want to add to that? Like anything you'd like to see media get right in the communities you cover?
I think for Puerto Rico, there's just so much historical context that is needed. You know, we need to talk about, like, a lot of people might not see Puerto Rico as a U.S. colony, but it is, you know, because there's this legal term, unincorporated territory, that's basically a euphemism. But we need to be very clear about the extractive policies, as well as right now we have a fiscal oversight board that has so much say that, you know, environmental organizations don't have the space to participate in the planification, and neither do communities. So we just need more citizen participation to have planning that actually addresses the needs of communities.
Would either of you like to add anything?
Sure. I think what I've noticed, especially back at home, and I'm speaking in terms of my country, Kenya, and the continent as a whole. In the past, there was this over-dramatization of climate-related issues and, you know, sensationalization of disasters. And you would read a particular story and you're like, wow, this would actually fit a very good script for a thriller movie, you know. So there's a lot of drama and there's, you know, sensationalization of the doom in terms of the deaths, you know, and the destruction. So you find that you read that entire story, but those who have been affected, you know, they have been missed out completely, and realize that in itself misses the story, because these are the people who are at the very local level who are affected by these disasters, you know, by these climate-related shocks. So over the recent years, the organization that I work with is called DIRAJ. It has a very long name, so bear with me. It's called Disaster Risk Reduction Network of Africa Journalists. I'll talk to my team so that we can have that name short. Yeah. So in short, it's called DIRAJ. So we normally, it's a Pan-African network that brings together journalists from across the continent who report on climate-related issues and disasters. So we decided to change the script here and sort of try to ensure that readers don't experience doom scrolling, because you would type anything on climate change and all you could see is doom and gloom. And you're like, wow, Armageddon is here, you know, the world is ending, there's no hope, that's it, let's shut down and go. So we decided to flip that script a little bit and kind of like just try to look at the other side. Yes, climate change is happening, disasters are happening, but what are communities doing, you know, at the very local level in terms of coming up with solutions to mitigate, you know, the effects of climate change? And you have seen that appetite of reporting on such issues from that lens increase tenfold, increase hundredfold. Like we normally receive submissions from our members voluntarily. Like somebody would go out there after they have attended, you know, some of our training sessions, and they would go and do, you know, a story on, you know, a climate-related story in a particular village of how, you know, people are coming up with solutions to deal with the issues of flooding, you know, in an area where they have been experiencing perennial flooding. So I think for us, that has been a game changer in terms of basically reporting, so that now at the end of the day, it becomes interesting to read this climate story, because I come from a TV background. One of the hardest tasks we have, especially if you're a climate, and I'm sure if you have TV journalists here, they will tell you, one of the hardest things that we face is, how do you turn these stories to become interesting? Yeah. You know, how do you make it sexy? How do you make it fun, you know? And for us, it's very simple. You know, take the angle of human interest, but at the same time, tie that human interest to solutions. Yeah. So that at the end of the day, somebody would read that story or look at that story and like, oh, wait, there's hope. You know, so I think for me, that has been the game changer for the past.
Thank you, everybody, we're going to take some questions now. And we were going to get into a conversation about solutions a bit more. We went a little bit long, so I encourage anyone to ask questions about solutions, and we can continue that conversation as that Duncan just talked about. So a reminder, as we go to questions, if we can't get to your questions, won't go unheard. You know, you can put them down on the flip charts that we have around here, with or without your name. And if you see your idea or question already up there, just put a +1 on it or a little heart. And there'll be mic runners to help you guide. And so we'll start taking questions now.
Hello. I have a question. I'm Monica from Business Insider, by the way. I have a question around sourcing, about sort of responsibly finding people and sort of coming with like a trauma-informed approach instead of just sort of, you know, poverty porn and like circling in on people who have gone through something, you know, sort of terrible. Is there any, I guess, suggestions on sort of how to properly approach people who aren't media trained, who are going through something traumatic, and sort of be very respectful in that sourcing process?
Does anyone want to answer that?
I think I liked what you said at the beginning of the panel about community, and I always encourage all of the people who file reports to us to get to know your neighbors, not just when there's something, a disaster, but get to know who your neighbors are, get to know your indigenous community. I know people who live in Albuquerque and have never gone to a reservation. So I think getting to know the people you're covering, and also I liked what Ezra had to say, hire people from the community at your organizations and go beyond that. And we see like there are a lot of mainstream organizations now that are devoting some time to Indigenous affairs reporting. So I think that's a great way to maybe address some of those. And I know Camille probably has definitely on the trauma-informed part.
I mean, the climate crisis comes from not being in right relationship with ourselves and the earth, you know, and thinking of ourselves as part of the earth. So I think first we have to hone our own practices, so when we show up, we don't show up with all our stresses or our agenda, but we show up with the intention to honor the people that we are interviewing and the ability to deeply listen, you know? So I think it's a lot of internal work, and surround yourself also with diversity, not only demographically, but people with different experiences, like psychologists or social workers that can give you some context of other ways that we can approach. Like if we only talk to journalists, that's not diversity. You know?
I think there's also practical, like, you're gonna get an assignment, it's gonna go to this wildfire, go to this flood, like how do you do that? And I think it's all about like kind of approaching with humility, like don't have your microphone on, get to know them first. How are they feeling? I know we want that tape that's like us getting to know them, but like they're like in one of the darkest moments of their life, right? Like maybe they don't want that moment on the radio of them like crying and or going through this moment. And it might make good radio or good TV, but like it might humiliate them.
Yeah.
And so I would talk to them first and then do the recording and then follow up with them. Like I know oftentimes we'll follow up and we'll send you this story and we forget about doing it, but actually do it. Like keep that community rolling, and that's how you'll get another story. Like they'll tell you like, and then this thing happened. Yeah. And then now you have another story. Yeah. And you can like have a relationship with them, and that's how you have sourcing. We'll take another question from the back there.
In one word, compassion.
Compassion, yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Jen Thompson from Solutions Journalism Network. My question is specifically, at least I noticed that in speaking about land back to a lot of white folks, but especially institutions, when they hear land back, they think, oh, we're just going to return the land, but they forget or at least refuse to acknowledge that they think it's returning land alongside all the harm they've already caused, and then expecting Indigenous communities to fix it when they had no part in that harm. In what ways have you or would you utilize journalism to educate people about the best practices in how to return land, and how have you seen that be successful?
Camille, Antonia, either of you have comments on this?
Yeah, I think that just even acknowledging the history, like listening to Indigenous programming, that's our mission. Is to a lot of our work is education. And we are doing work for our people, so we're not necessarily going back to tell, the full from beginning of time, because we're hearing from our voices, we're hearing from Indigenous communities, and I think that's really important, is that education part of it. And I think that's one of the best things to do, is to, like I said, get to know the history, get to know there is a lot of historical trauma, there is a lot of deep stuff to dive into. And so I think finding a number of voices, like I said, from the grassroots people who are on the ground doing stuff, to tribal leaders, all the way to the White House. There's so many different levels when you're looking at Indigenous stories, and a lot of different perspectives. And there's more than 500 federally recognized tribes. We also cover stories of Indigenous communities around the world that don't have the same sort of federal trust responsibility that federally recognized tribes have. So I think that would be one of some of my recommendations.
I would add, you have an opportunity for like your sourcing to like interview people of color for your stories, but you have an opportunity to have like people of color be the experts in your story as well. Like when you take like 10 more minutes and do like another Google search of who are like, search a few more universities, there might be like Indigenous people or Black people or Asian people or Mexican people who are like also experts in that and like have an understanding of that culture, those people, maybe not directly, but they often are doing like specific work in those communities. And just like those 5 or 10 minutes of like doing that like Googling will help your story. And then it often like honors the people in the story more. Like they feel like someone else in the story, they're not explaining who I am. Like this like climate scientist or this person's not explaining who I am and what I'm going through. And I've heard positive feedback from people in my stories about that. And so encourage you to do that. Back there.
Hi, I'm Ethan from the Sweaty Penguin. So Camille, you mentioned self-determination, and something I've been reflecting on recently is I think a lot of stories that will spotlight Indigenous communities sometimes will spotlight one perspective on, say, a project or a pipeline or some issue, and not necessarily the diversity of opinion within the community, and then kind of whatever the outcome is, it's either a win or a loss, but not really showing that they did not have agency in that decision regardless of what it was. So I'm curious if you have advice for how, as journalists, we can learn and understand the diversity of opinion and cover process more than just outcome.
Wow. It's still something that we're learning to do. But for us, part of what we're doing is integrating ourselves into community by hiring community liaisons and being able to facilitate experiences such as workshops where we're really almost acompañar, like guiding or being a facilitator. So the community tells us, what do you want us to investigate? And then follow their curiosity. And eventually we'd like to hire community journalists so they can tell their own stories. But in that sense, it's really important because sometimes we talk to the same leaders. So it's important to go to the businesses of a place that you're covering, find the church or these different pockets of places where you can hear diversity of opinions and thoughts. Yeah.
Right. Go for it, yeah.
What have you come across in your reporting, and this question's for everyone, if y'all don't mind, what have you come across in your reporting as it relates to indigenous practices that your communities are tuning into to return the earth to what it was?
I worked in the Central Valley for a long time of California, and I covered the Sierra Nevada for about 8 years, and there was a lot of talk, or a lot of really cool practices of like turning, what do you call it, meadows, restoring meadows and making them back into these aquifers that can hold water and not just dry up forests. And it was really, so there was a time where there was a lot of beautiful stories, cool stories from that, about taking back that land and like restoring it. And I think like there's like all these natural practices that Indigenous people have that are super important, and we can cover those. Do you guys want to add anything?
Yeah, I have been reporting on a village where the lands of farmers were taken away to build a coal power plant, and now, I mean, imagine these farmers have never even gone to school, but now they are working towards, they have got their lands back, and now they're working towards creating a solar park over there, and they're going to use the solar energy in agriculture as well, and in the schools where their children go. So I think that was a very positive sunshine story to cover.
Yeah, so there's this community back at home in Kenya, located at the southeast coastal part of the country. They started this initiative. In Kiswahili, it's called Mikoko Pamoja. So if you translate that to English, it means mangroves together. So when you go to the coastal area, you'll realize that, and I think this is synonymous with other coastal areas across the globe. You realize that mangroves thrive along those areas because they thrive because of the salty nature of the water, right? So we know what mangroves do. One of the things that they do is they tend to fend off excess tides, that come to the shore. But other than that, they are carbon sequesters, So there was a lot of deforestation that was happening in that particular area. So guys would get into the forest and they would cut all these mangroves, and that area would be exposed to lots of risk. So the community, and what's unique about this story is how the women actually took that initiative. So the women decided to take charge and protect the mangroves. So they went and replanted the mangroves, and they took it upon themselves. This wasn't even a government initiative. They took it upon themselves to protect those mangroves. So if somebody is found to be cutting those trees, then the community takes action before they forward that person to the authorities. And what is unique about that particular story, and if you're looking at it from an indigenous perspective, is how these communities realized the importance of protecting, a very interesting ecosystem, the name of mangroves, because that forest would in turn benefit them, because they would sell the carbon, through carbon credit trading, and then they would get the money, and then that money they would use it to, do things in the community. If you walk around that community, you'll find that schools have been built because of that forest. You'll find that students have books, desks, there is water supply in that particular area. So I think for me, such stories that look at those solutions from a very local level, and especially if you're looking at, you talk about the indigenous community, or the vulnerable community, or the marginalized community. Those are the kind of stories that I think they deserve to get the front page and to be told every so often, so that we don't get to see doom scrolling all the time. So you just scroll and you're like, oh, there's a group of women in Kenya who actually are doing something amazing. And these are women from I think from the ages of 20 all the way to 80.
Wow.
So they take charge and the men follow later.
That's awesome. So community solutions in action.
Yep.
We'll take a question from this side.
Hi there, Charles Ellis in the bnote.com. Fantastic, fascinating discussion. Quick follow-up comment to that partner and also liaison with the community discussion that's been happening earlier. Just sticking with core, looking for core institutions in those communities. So it's just from my experience in dealing with Black American communities in places like Philadelphia, DC, Black churches. 60% of Black people still go to church. Or, in a lot of media reporting, I don't see media outlets going to HBCU land-grant universities to talk about food security and climate science research that they're doing. You're going to, predominantly white institutions for that research, but start going to them to get that research. Real quick follow-up question. How do you get these vulnerable populations, marginalized populations that are the most impacted, convinced that they are impacted by climate? Because a lot of communities are typically who are vulnerable and marginalized in a lot of major metropolitan areas are talking about violence, they're talking about poverty, they're talking about public health concerns. So how do you make those connections on those issues to climate?
I think for me what would be important is giving these vulnerable communities or these indigenous community a platform so that they're able to speak out their stories. I'm very passionate about human interest stories, because especially the kind of stories where there is no narration, it's just first-person narrative. So you would find out that some of these stories or some of these people will have very interesting perspectives about the issues or the challenges that they're facing, or even solutions that they're coming up with. So I think for me what would be important is if you let them speak about what they are going through, uninterrupted, uncut, then it becomes easy for them even to relate to the issues that they are going through. And then it's a win for us as journalists, because you let them speak about their issues, then the viewer is able to empathize with them. So the viewer is able to connect from an emotional perspective, so that they're able to understand that, oh wait, if there's a hurricane that has happened in a particular area, or cyclone in a particular area, there's drought that has ravaged a particular area, and those who that have been affected are telling those stories firsthand, then it becomes easy to connect the dots, so that these people are able to understand that, wait, this disaster actually happened because of 1, 2, 3. And the viewer also is able to connect and understand that this is the reason why this particular community always is at risk of, facing climate shocks and stuff.
I also think often communities don't believe in climate change that I'm talking to. There's like parts of the community don't believe in it. Like I did a story in Pajaro, that's a community that flooded in March in Monterey County, and one of the women I talked to doesn't believe in climate change, but she's like witnessing it. And so there's like, as a climate journalist, I also feel a duty and a little bit to educate and to have a conversation and to like have a relationship. So over the months of us talking about climate change and what's happening with her family, I can't say if she believes in climate change now, but she knows something's happening in her life. Like her town is flooding, and it might flood again in the next 5 years. And like, we have this relationship now, and it's like built on trust. And I think you have an opportunity to like talk about what you know. Like, we're some of the smartest people in the room. Like, you've done all the research, you've talked to all the scientists, you've like talked to all the community members. Like, you have this like hearth of knowledge inside of you, and like you can impart some wisdom because you have it. I'll take another question from the back.
Thank you. This question is mostly for Duncan and Antonia as editors. So I've had the honor to work with writers across the world, and I've noticed that a lot of times writers who are from often frontline communities feel that they have to tell the trauma first to be able to convince an editor that that story is important. So I was just curious for you two as editors, what are some tips and strategies to sort of move away from, or helping your writers sort of approach their story differently? Yeah.
Wow, that's a very intricate balance, especially if you come from a newsroom. There's normally that scuffle, because you want the story to sell, or you want that story to be the first one to be read, or to appear on the Google search and stuff. I think it requires intelligence in terms of balancing, the disaster and the outcome, so to say. I think it's important to highlight those numbers. It's important so that you basically put the context in terms of how huge that disaster was. But for us, what we intend to do is we don't spend so much time on the numbers, because that's where, like I said previously, that's where the story gets lost. So we don't focus so much on those numbers. Like I remember when a few months ago, when we had that devastating earthquake that affected Turkey and Syria. It reminded me of the COVID situation. So it was race against time, so that we get to know the following day how many numbers do we have in terms of the deaths. And they kept on increasing and increasing and increasing. I'm like, wait, there's a huge story here that is missing. Perhaps we need to talk about resilient infrastructure. Perhaps we need to talk about why is it that so many buildings crumbled? Is it that the construction authority in those particular countries did not anticipate that these disasters would happen, and so they would build what we call resilient infrastructures that would withstand this kind of shocks, right? So I think for me, there needs to be that level of balance where, yes, you can put the numbers for context purposes, but you wouldn't want to spend so much time on that. When COVID struck, people would spend so much time on the what's the name of that website? Worldometer. Because every single day the numbers kept on increasing. The numbers kept on increasing, and you're like, oh wow, we're at 1 million. So the next day, oh wow, we're at 2 million. So the number, and they're like, wait, hold on. There is more to, COVID than just those numbers increasing. So I think for me there needs to be that balance, so that you're able to, yes, give context, but also look at the situation from the other lens.
I think I would add to make sure you're humanizing the story. Why should the readers care? Why is this interesting? For example, a huge typhoon hit Western Alaska last year, and the story was, why was it so important? It devastated these communities. It devastated the people who rely on a subsistence way of life. They have to, it took out their subsistence foods that they've, from hunting, fishing, gathering. This typhoon also destroyed the tools they used to get those foods. They can't go to a grocery store and spend like, I don't know how much milk is, but you know, $20 for a gallon of milk, and in a store, they rely on this food, and it was so devastating to these communities that this typhoon hit. And not only that, there's a lot of issues that we cover, from drought in the Southwest to wildfires. So why is this so important in humanizing those individual stories of how the climate is impacting their everyday lives?
Yeah. I also think if you spend enough time with the people in the story, like, you're gonna have moments of like joy in those interviews, and you're gonna laugh, and you're gonna cry, and you're gonna, and you can use those like as like the nuggets in your story, and like maybe start there, or maybe have that in your story somewhere. Like, if there's this like joyful moment, like put that in there, and don't just make them victims. They're also like happy people in the worst circumstance, right? Because they're thinking about their future already.
Absolutely.
I think that's something, going to the question they asked about the ancestral knowledge that we've learned in this. Even though we had this very tragic hurricane, it also brought a lot of unity, and that's actually something my mom told me when I was very young and I experienced a hurricane. She said, Camille, hurricanes are hard, but they bring us together. And we witnessed that, and especially in Puerto Rico, we have this dance called bomba, and it comes from our African ancestors. And it's a dance where you have a lot of drums, and you have one dancer who's controlling one of the drums. And there's been a resurgence of this dance because it's a dance of resistance, and it's a dance also of finding joy in the difficult situations. And that's always important to find as well, because justice is also joy. Like, if we can't be happy, then what is it all for? Like,
I also think that when we as climate reporters are pitching our stories, we need to have a more holistic approach. So it's not just one climate story that we're doing. Regular follow-ups are needed to keep the story alive. Unfortunately, the crisis is so bad, but we're still living in the times in our newsrooms where that constant hammering is needed. So it's not just a climate story. The next follow-up is how it's a public health story, how it's going to affect our health at large, how it's an agriculture story, how it's a mental health story.
Exactly.
So I think these follow-ups and having a more holistic approach is very important when pitching this story.
yes.
We're going to end here actually now, and I wanted to say thank you to all of you. And just actually something you said, Camille, like about community. Like, we're all a community in this room. Like, we're a community of climate journalists around the world, and we can follow up with each other in the same way. Like, we can honor each other, we can learn from each other, we can message each other. Like, there's a million social media platforms. Find each other on one, and like learn from each other. And like, I just want to thank you all. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.